I was washing my late Grandpa Henry's favorite porcelain teacup right after his funeral reception when my phone screen lit up on the kitchen island. A text message from my younger sister Vanessa flashed across the glass. Money transfer successful. We are in New York. Thanks for the inheritance, loser. I did not drop the teacup. I did not gasp or burst into tears. Instead, I carefully turned off the faucet, picked up a linen towel, and dried the delicate china. A cold, knowing smile spread across my face. What my sister and her husband Jamal did not realize was that I had intentionally placed exactly $300,000 into that specific joint account just 24 hours earlier. They thought they had just pulled off the ultimate heist against our dead grandfather. In reality, they had just swallowed a massive federally mandated bait. My name is Rebecca, 33 years old, and I am a forensic accountant who specializes in investigating high-level financial fraud. I have spent my entire career tracking down hidden assets and putting white-collar criminals behind bars. So when my own family tried to scam me, I did not get mad. I got to work. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that underestimated your intelligence. You will definitely want to hear how this arrogant move cost them absolutely everything. To understand the sheer audacity of Vanessa's text message, we have to go back exactly 1 hour. The sky over the Boston suburb was a bruised, heavy gray, pouring freezing rain over my black wool coat. I stood entirely alone at the edge of my grandfather's open grave. The cemetery was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the umbrellas held by the funeral directors. I watched the mahogany casket slowly lower into the muddy earth, feeling a profound, hollow ache in my chest. Grandpa Henry was the only person in my family who had ever truly seen my potential, the only one who encouraged me to build my own independent life instead of relying on handouts. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the sparse crowd of distant relatives who had bothered to show up for the actual burial. The absence of two specific people was glaringly obvious. Vanessa and her husband Jamal were nowhere to be seen. Jamal is a 32-year-old Black African-American man who spends every waking moment portraying himself as a high-rolling entrepreneur. He is the kind of guy who leased a Porsche he could barely afford and plastered his social media with pictures of expensive watches, all while secretly drowning in credit card debt. Vanessa, my parents' golden child, eagerly played the role of the wealthy socialite wife. They had spent the last 5 years treating Grandpa Henry like their personal automated teller machine, draining his generosity under the guise of funding Jamal's endless string of failed business ventures. Yet here we were at the final goodbye for the man who had funded their lavish delusions, and they could not even be bothered to stand in the rain for 10 minutes. The disrespect was palpable. The cold dampness seeped through my shoes, but the chill in my bones came purely from the realization of their absolute selfishness. I knew exactly why they had skipped the burial. They were too busy executing what they believed was a master plan to drain his accounts before the lawyers could freeze his assets. They assumed I was just a boring numbers girl too consumed by grief to notice their sudden disappearance from the church. As the cemetery workers began to shovel the wet earth over the vault, I felt a familiar, sharp clarity wash over my mind. The morning granddaughter routine was over. The forensic accountant had officially clocked in. I turned my back on the grave and walked toward my car, the sound of the rain masking the quiet calculation happening in my brain. I had spent the last 2 years legally and meticulously organizing my grandfather's estate building, an ironclad financial fortress that no greedy relative could ever penetrate. Vanessa and Jamal thought they were holding all the winning cards simply because they managed to steal a banking password and run off to Manhattan. They had no idea that every single move they made was being tracked, documented, and flagged. They had no idea that the money they just transferred was not a free windfall, but a carefully laid trap involving federal tax codes. The arrogance that fueled their sudden trip to New York was exactly what I was counting on. As I started my engine and drove away from the cemetery, my phone remained silent in the passenger seat, waiting for the inevitable notification. I knew they would take the bait. I just needed to be patient. And then, as I stood in the kitchen washing that teacup, the notification finally arrived, sealing their fate completely. I placed the porcelain teacup carefully on the granite drying rack, letting the weight of that notification sink in. But to fully appreciate the trap they had just walked into, we need to return to the timeline of the funeral. Right after the cemetery workers finished their grim task, I drove straight to the reception being held at Grandpa Henry's sprawling estate. The catering staff had already set up a somber spread in the dining room. I walked through the heavy front doors, my black wool coat still damp. I was physically exhausted, freezing cold, and deeply emotionally drained. A foolish part of me hoped my parents might actually step up and offer comfort. I was their eldest daughter, and I had just buried the patriarch of our family entirely alone. Instead of a warm embrace, I was ambushed the second I stepped into the foyer. My mother, Susan, marched toward me with her jaw clenched and eyes blazing with misplaced fury. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not offer to take my wet coat. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve, and pulled me into the adjoining parlor away from the guests. My father, Richard, trailed right behind her, glaring at me as if I were a trespasser in my own grandfather's house. "Are you happy now, Rebecca?" My mother hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "You made your sister so incredibly depressed that she could not even bear to attend the burial. You drove her away on the hardest day of her life." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the mental gymnastics. "I drove her away. I have not spoken a single word to Vanessa since Tuesday. I was the one standing in the mud while the priest read the final rites." "Where exactly were they, Mother?" "Vanessa is fragile." Susan snapped back, her face flushing with anger. "She is carrying an immense amount of stress right now. Jamal's boutique logistics business is struggling because the market is terrible, and you know how deeply Vanessa feels his failures. She is practically having a nervous breakdown over their finances. The last thing she needed today was your suffocating, judgmental attitude making her feel worse. She needed a safe space to grieve, and you ruined it by demanding everyone adhere to your rigid schedule." The sheer absurdity of her defense almost made me laugh out loud. For years, Susan and Richard had acted as the ultimate enablers, blindly worshipping the ground Jamal walked on simply because he wore designer suits and spoke loudly about his fake investment portfolios. They treated Vanessa like a delicate glass doll, while I was treated like the family workhorse expected to carry every burden without a single word of gratitude. I stepped back, deliberately removing my mother's hand from my arm. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a low, deadpan register. "A safe space to grieve?" I asked coldly. "Is that what you call skipping the cemetery to go to the airport? Because when I was leaving the church to ride in the hearse, I saw Jamal's trunk open. If he is so financially ruined and Vanessa is so paralyzed by depression, I am curious why he felt the urgent need to pack his $3,000 limited edition Titleist golf clubs into his leased Porsche before they sped off. Does grief suddenly require 18 holes on a championship course?" My father stepped forward, his face turning an ugly shade of red. "Do not speak to your mother that way, and do not disrespect Jamal," Richard barked, pointing a thick finger at my face. "Jamal is a visionary. He is networking. He is doing whatever it takes to provide for your sister. You sit behind a desk looking at spreadsheets all day. You have no idea what it takes to build a real empire. You are just bitter and jealous of the life they are building." "Building an empire on exactly whose dime?" I shot back, refusing to break eye contact. "Grandpa Henry funded every single one of Jamal's catastrophic failures, and now that Grandpa is gone, the bank is permanently closed. I suggest you tell your visionary son-in-law to start looking for a minimum wage job." Richard slammed his heavy hand against the mahogany side table, rattling the framed family photos sitting on top. "You arrogant, ungrateful brat," he growled. The tension in the parlor was thick enough to cut with a knife. Guests in the hallway were beginning to turn their heads, their hushed whispers drifting into the room. But Susan and Richard did not care about making a scene. They only cared about protecting their precious golden child and preserving the pathetic illusion of Jamal's massive success. Richard took a rigid step forward, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of fabricated dominance. He reached into the inside pocket of his navy suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. Without a shred of hesitation, he threw it directly at my chest. The envelope grazed my collarbone before fluttering to the hardwood floor between us. The hushed whispers from the hallway instantly died down. Complete silence blanketed the room. I did not flinch. I slowly lowered my gaze to the envelope, then back up to his flushed, angry face. "Pick it up," Richard commanded, his voice echoing in the parlor. "That is the final invoice from the funeral home. $25,000. Since you love controlling everything, you can foot the bill. You are a fancy forensic accountant with no husband and no children to feed. You have nothing but disposable income hoarding up in your bank accounts. Vanessa and Jamal need their capital for real investments. They are trying to build generational wealth, and they cannot tie up their business liquidity burying your grandfather just because you wanted a premium casket." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the stale air. Generational wealth. It was a trendy buzzword Jamal had fed them to excuse his constant begging for seed money. My father, a man who leased the same mid-tier vehicle for a decade just to keep up appearances, was lecturing me about liquidity over his father's memorial. He was publicly admitting he could not afford to bury his own father while shaming me for having a lucrative career. Susan stood beside him, nodding as if he had just delivered a masterclass in financial logic. I did not bend down to pick up the envelope. I refused to bow to them. Instead, I calmly reached into my leather handbag and pulled out my wallet. The soft click of the clasp sounded like a gunshot. I bypassed my standard bank cards and slid out my metal black American Express Centurion card. I held it casually, letting the matte black finish catch the muted light of the crystal chandelier. "Mr. Davis," I called out, my voice clear, steady, and intentionally loud enough to reach the eavesdropping relatives in the hallway. The funeral director, who had been awkwardly standing near the coat rack, holding a leather binder, flinched and stepped cautiously into the doorway. "Yes, Miss Rebecca," he asked nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. "My father seems to have dropped your invoice," I said, never breaking eye contact with Richard. "And it appears he is experiencing some severe personal liquidity issues at the moment. He simply does not have the funds. Please process the entire $25,000 on this card. Furthermore, include an additional 20% gratuity for your staff for standing out in the freezing rain today. Since my immediate family could not be bothered to show up, your team was my only support." Mr. Davis quickly stepped forward, retrieved his mobile payment terminal from his briefcase, and gently took the heavy metal card from my hand. The machine beeped approvingly in less than 3 seconds. The massive transaction was instantly authorized. I took my card back and slid it into my wallet with a satisfying sharp snap. I looked back at my father, whose face had shifted from an angry crimson to a pale, humiliated white. His jaw worked silently. The extended relatives in the hallway were no longer whispering secretly. They were openly staring at him with wide eyes and poorly concealed pity. My Uncle Gregory shook his head in disgust. Richard had tried to assert his dominance by treating me like an automated teller machine, but instead he broadcasted to our entire family that he was completely broke. Susan dropped her arms, her smug expression melting into absolute mortification as she noticed the judgmental stares from her own sisters. "Generational wealth is a truly fascinating concept, Dad," I said smoothly, stepping close enough so only he and my mother could hear the final blow. "But you cannot build generational wealth when you are actively draining the previous generation dry to fund a lifestyle you never earned." Grandpa Henry knew exactly who was financially draining him, and he knew exactly who was actually protecting his legacy behind closed doors. "You wanted me to foot the bill so Jamal could play pretend billionaire in New York with Vanessa Fine. The bill is fully paid, but do not ever mistake my quiet composure for weakness again. You have absolutely no idea what kind of storm is coming for your precious golden child. I turned and walked away, leaving them standing in stunned silence. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my small designer leather handbag again. I walked away from the parlor, leaving my parents drowning in the uncomfortable silence they had created for themselves. The heavy oak doors of Grandpa Henry's library stood partially open at the far end of the hallway. I slipped inside, closing the door firmly behind me to shut out the whispers of my judging relatives. The library smelled exactly like him, a comforting blend of old paper leather bindings and the faint trace of peppermint. It was here at his massive mahogany desk that we had spent countless hours over the past 2 years, untangling the financial mess Jamal had dragged him into. My leather handbag vibrated again, much more insistently this time. I reached inside and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated the dim room with a stark, bright banner notification from the banking application I use to monitor the estate. I swiped the screen to unlock it, my heart maintaining a steady, calm rhythm. I opened the secure portal and stared at the transaction ledger. Right there it was, an outgoing wire transfer in the exact amount of $300,000. The funds had been successfully routed from Grandpa Henry's secondary checking account directly into Jamal's primary business account. The precise transaction timestamp showed it had been initiated just as the priest was reading the final prayers at the cemetery. I leaned against the edge of the desk and let out a soft, genuine laugh. They actually did it. I had predicted their absolute greed, but seeing the digital proof laid out in black and white was profoundly satisfying. Vanessa must have used the old tablet Grandpa kept in his nightstand. She always assumed she was the smart one for memorizing his basic passwords, completely unaware that I had installed security monitoring software on all his devices months ago. She thought she was sneaking under the radar, bypassing probate court to secure her husband's fake empire. What Vanessa and Jamal did not know was the true nature of that specific bank account. 6 months ago, when Grandpa Henry's health began to rapidly decline, I restructured his assets to protect them from my family. I intentionally left that one checking account open, perfectly visible, and funded with exactly $300,000. To the untrained eye, it looked like a forgotten cash reserve. But as a forensic accountant, I never leave loose ends. That account was legally designated as a federal escrow holding account. The funds inside were strictly earmarked to pay the Internal Revenue Service for Grandpa Henry's estate taxes. By logging into a deceased man's bank account and wiring that money across state lines, Vanessa and Jamal had not just stolen from our family, they had stolen from the federal government. They had committed grand larceny, wire fraud, and tax evasion all in one single click. Furthermore, by routing it directly into Jamal's failing business account, they were illegally commingling stolen federal funds with corporate assets. The moment the funds settled into his account in New York, they crossed federal jurisdictions. They had practically gift-wrapped themselves for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I walked over to the large bay window overlooking the driveway. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the manicured lawns glistening in the gray afternoon light. I imagined Jamal and Vanessa right now probably popping an outrageously expensive bottle of champagne in whatever luxury hotel suite they had booked in Manhattan. They were celebrating their perceived victory, convinced they had outsmarted the boring accountant's sister. They probably thought they were untouchable, wrapped in the protective bubble of my parents' blind adoration. They were spending money that already belonged to the United States Treasury, treating stolen tax dollars like a personal lottery win. I unlocked my phone again and drafted a quick encrypted email to the legal team managing the estate, attaching the timestamped screenshot of the wire transfer. I instructed them to immediately notify the banking fraud department and the authorities of the unauthorized breach. The wheels of federal justice are known to turn slowly, but when you steal 6 figures from the IRS, those wheels suddenly move with terrifying, unstoppable speed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. My parents wanted to label me the villain for refusing to fund Jamal's delusions. They wanted to protect Vanessa from the harsh realities of the real world. Now they were going to learn a devastating lesson about accountability. I grabbed my damp wool coat from the leather armchair, took one last look around the library, and walked out. The funeral reception was still buzzing with gossip as I slipped out the front door and headed toward my car. The storm in Boston was clearing up, but a massive catastrophic hurricane was about to hit my sister in New York. And I had a premium front row seat to watch their entire pathetic house of cards completely and utterly unfold. I did not have to wait long for the show to begin. I walked back into the main reception area just in time to see my mother holding her smartphone high in the air, her face glowing with a sickeningly sweet smile. The volume was turned all the way up, echoing over the quiet murmurs of the remaining funeral guests. I stood quietly near the heavy velvet drapes blending into the shadows of the living room while my parents huddled around the small glowing screen. On the display, Vanessa and Jamal were practically vibrating with smug energy. The background behind them was unmistakable to anyone familiar with Manhattan luxury. High vaulted ceilings, gold leaf crown molding a massive crystal chandelier, and a stunning panoramic view of Central Park. They had actually checked into the presidential suite at the Plaza Hotel, a room that easily cost upwards of $5,000 a night. Jamal was struggling with a bottle of Dom Perignon. With a loud pop, the cork flew across the luxurious room, and Vanessa squealed in delight as the expensive champagne foamed over his hands. "Cheers to Grandpa Henry," Jamal shouted into the camera, holding up a crystal flute. "The man finally did something right. Look at this place, Susan. Your daughter is living like absolute royalty tonight." My mother clapped her hands together, tears of joy welling in her eyes, completely forgetting she was supposed to be mourning her father-in-law in a house full of grieving relatives. "Oh, Vanessa, it is absolutely breathtaking," Susan gushed loudly. "You both deserve this so much after all the stress you have been under. Jamal, you are such a brilliant provider. I knew you would take care of my little girl." Richard leaned into the frame, his earlier humiliation at my hands momentarily forgotten in the face of Jamal's stolen wealth. "That is exactly what I am talking about." My father beamed, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. "Taking initiative, securing that early inheritance before the lawyers and the state try to tie it up in probate court. You kids are playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers." I felt a cold smirk tug at the corner of my mouth. They were literally confessing to circumventing probate on a recorded digital platform. Vanessa took a sip of her champagne and pouted her lips in a mock display of sympathy, adjusting her designer sunglasses, which she was inexplicably wearing indoors. "Is Rebecca still there? Mom? Is she still wearing that hideous black coat and bossing the catering staff around? I bet she is so mad she got stuck in the rain cleaning up folding chairs while we flew first class." Susan let out a sharp, cruel laugh that carried across the parlor. "Let her clean. That is all she is good for. She is probably sitting in a corner right now, auditing the funeral receipts. She has no idea how to actually live, honey. She is just a bitter, lonely accountant." I stood motionless, sipping a glass of sparkling water, letting their insults wash over me without leaving a single mark. It was truly fascinating to watch a family construct their own prison cell out of pure arrogance. They were celebrating a wire fraud felony on a FaceTime call in front of half a dozen extended relatives who were pretending not to listen while aggressively eating cocktail shrimp. Jamal leaned close to the camera, his eyes gleaming with a manic, greedy light. "Tell Rebecca that if she behaves herself, I might hire her to do the bookkeeping for my new logistics firm. Since we finally have our seed money, I am taking this operation national by next quarter." National. He meant moving the stolen funds across even more state lines. Every arrogant word out of his mouth was adding another year to his inevitable federal sentence. He was building an empire on quicksand financed by the Internal Revenue Service. The call continued for another 10 minutes, a nauseating display of bragging and sheer delusion. They gave a virtual tour of the suite, showing off the marble soaking tub, the plush monogrammed robes, and the fresh orchids on the dining table. My parents drank it all in validating every single terrible decision their golden child was making. Finally, Vanessa blew a kiss to the screen, announcing they had reservations at a Michelin-starred restaurant and were heading out for a night of luxury. The screen went dark, and Susan sighed contentedly, turning to Richard to whisper about how incredibly proud she was of their success. I placed my empty glass on a passing waiter's tray and slipped out the back door heading for my car. They had their moment of glory. They had their expensive champagne and their delusions of grandeur. But the banking systems in the United States operate on very specific, rigid protocols. It was already late afternoon. By midnight, the fraud alerts would fully process, the federal holds would be placed, and the Plaza Hotel would try to pre-authorize the massive deposit for that $5,000 a night suite. The clock was ticking rapidly, and Jamal's stolen carriage was about to turn into a federal indictment. I drove back to my quiet suburban townhouse, the stark contrast to the chaotic funeral reception, providing an immediate sense of relief. I peeled off my damp black wool coat and the restrictive funeral dress, exchanging them for silk pajamas. I poured myself a single glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, opened my laptop on the kitchen island, and began reviewing client files. Hours passed. The rain outside picked up again, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my living room. I watched the clock on my microwave shift from midnight to 1 in the morning and then finally to 2. My phone, which had been resting silently beside my wine glass, suddenly erupted with an aggressive ringtone. The bright screen illuminated the dark kitchen. The caller identification displayed Jamal's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow sip of my wine before I finally swiped to answer. I did not say hello. I just pressed the phone to my ear and waited. The background noise was deafening. The heavy, pulsating bass of a Manhattan nightclub throbbed through the speaker, mixed with the sound of clinking glasses and overlapping voices. And then came Jamal's voice, completely devoid of the smug, polished tone he had paraded on FaceTime just a few hours earlier. He was furious, his words slurring slightly from the expensive champagne he had been downing all night. "Unfreeze my accounts right now, you jealous witch!" Jamal screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking over the loud club music. "I know exactly what you are doing. You called the bank and put a fraudulent hold on my primary business account. Do you have any idea how much money you are messing with? I have 3 potential investors sitting at my VIP table right now, and the waitress just handed me back 4 different declined credit cards. You are humiliating me in front of industry leaders." I leaned back against the cool marble counter, swirling the red wine in my glass. "I have not spoken to your bank, Jamal. Perhaps you simply reached your credit limit, or perhaps you should not be trying to impress investors with money you do not actually possess." "Do not play stupid with me, Rebecca," he roared, the panic bleeding through his rage. "The concierge at the plaza just called my cell phone, too. They said the deposit for the presidential suite was flagged, and they are threatening to lock us out. You are the only one with the account numbers to Grandpa Henry's estate. You are illegally interfering with my inheritance because you cannot stand the fact that Vanessa chose a real man who knows how to hustle while you sit alone in an empty house." Jamal was practically hyperventilating now, stepping away from the loud club music into what sounded like a quieter hallway or bathroom. "This is exactly what you did last year. You are completely obsessed with destroying my potential. My crypto startup was weeks away from a major breakthrough. I had the developers lined up, I had the marketing strategy ready, but you just had to step in and whisper poison into the old man's ear. You manipulated Grandpa Henry into pulling my $200,000 seed funding just because you did not understand the blockchain market. You ruined my company then, and you are trying to ruin my logistics firm now." I listened to his unhinged revisionist history with mild amusement. He conveniently omitted the fact that his crypto startup was actually a documented Ponzi scheme. I had stepped in to save Grandpa Henry from losing everything. Jamal had lost $50,000 in the first week alone. "You are vindictive, Rebecca." Jamal continued to rant, his voice echoing off the tiled walls of whatever club bathroom he was hiding in. You cannot stand seeing a successful entrepreneur building an empire that outshines your boring corporate spreadsheets. You want to keep Vanessa and me dependent on your handouts. Well, it is not going to work. Grandpa left that $300,000 for us to build our future. It is our money. I am giving you exactly 5 minutes to call the fraud department and clear those holds, or I am calling my lawyers and suing you for financial sabotage and emotional distress. I let him finish his tantrum. He was breathing heavily into the microphone, waiting for me to apologize or panic. He genuinely believed his aggressive intimidation tactics would work on me, the way they worked on my mother and father. He thought screaming louder made him right. I took another measured sip of my Cabernet, savoring the rich flavor completely undisturbed by his empty threats. The foundation of his fake empire was already crumbling, and he was too blind to see the wrecking ball swinging right toward his head. Are you finished? I asked, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. The heavy breathing on the other end of the line faltered for a fraction of a second. Jamal scoffed a weak attempt to maintain his aggressive facade. Do not try your corporate intimidation tactics on me, Rebecca. I want those accounts unfrozen right now, or I am calling my legal team. By all means, Jamal, call your legal team, I replied smoothly, taking a slow step away from the kitchen counter. In fact, I highly encourage you to put them on speakerphone right now so I can save them the trouble of explaining basic federal law to a man who thinks he is smarter than the United States government. What are you talking about? He snapped through the bravado in his tone was rapidly evaporating. Let us talk about Vanessa's power of attorney, I said, my voice cutting through the thumping club music in the background of his call like a scalpel. My sister always loved throwing that document in my face. She loved reminding everyone that Grandpa Henry trusted her to pay his utility bills and manage his day-to-day expenses. But it seems neither of you actually bothered to read the fine print of the document you were so proud of holding. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him sweat. A power of attorney is not a magical blank check, Jamal. I continued, my tone shifting into the precise, clinical cadence I used when destroying white-collar criminals in court. It is a living legal instrument, key word being living. Under the law, a power of attorney expires the exact second the principal stops breathing. The very millisecond Grandpa Henry's heart stopped beating in that hospital bed, Vanessa's legal authority to touch a single penny of his money completely evaporated into thin air. That is a lie, Jamal stammered, his voice dropping an octave. The loud club music in the background suddenly sounded very far away, overshadowed by the deafening reality of my words. We are his family. It is an early inheritance. He wanted us to have it. There is no such thing as an early inheritance from a dead man, I corrected sharply. When Grandpa Henry died, his entire estate immediately became a separate legal entity. You and Vanessa did not just transfer family money. You logged into a deceased man's bank account, assumed a false identity by using an expired authorization, and transferred $300,000 of estate funds into your failing business account. I could hear the frantic shuffling on the other end. He was pacing. The tile floor of the bathroom squeaked beneath his expensive designer shoes. But you did not just stop there. I pressed on, tightening the metaphorical noose. If you had kept the money in Massachusetts, it would have been simple theft. But you had to go to New York, did you not? You had to stay at the Plaza Hotel. You had to pop champagne in Manhattan. By moving $300,000 of stolen funds across state boundaries, you elevated this from a local family dispute to a severe federal crime. Rebecca, stop playing games, he whispered, his breath hitching. I am not playing games, Jamal. I am explaining your indictment. Under Title 18, United States Code Section 1343, what you and Vanessa committed this afternoon is classified as wire fraud. It carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. And because you routed those stolen funds directly into your corporate accounts, you also triggered federal money laundering statutes. The silence on the line was absolute. Even the muffled bass of the nightclub seemed to have vanished, leaving only the sound of Jamal's shallow, panicked breathing. "I did not freeze your accounts out of jealousy," I stated coldly, delivering the final crushing blow. "I am the executor of the estate legally bound to report theft. The moment those funds moved, the bank's automated fraud algorithms flagged the cross-state transfer of a deceased client's assets. The federal government froze your accounts, Jamal. The Internal Revenue Service flagged your business. You are not dealing with me anymore, you are dealing with the FBI." "No." Jamal gasped, a pathetic strangled sound escaping his throat. "No, we just wanted to celebrate. Vanessa said it was fine." "Enjoy the rest of your champagne," I whispered. There was a sharp clatter followed by a harsh scraping noise as the phone slipped from Jamal's trembling hands and hit the floor. He dropped it in paralyzing horror. The line remained connected, broadcasting the hollow echo of a man who realized his fake empire was destroyed. I pressed the red button to end the call, finishing the last sip of my wine. While I rested in my quiet suburban home in Boston, the harsh reality of federal banking regulations violently crashed down on my sister and her husband in Manhattan. Jamal never returned to his VIP table at the nightclub or bought drinks for his imaginary investors. According to the police report I obtained later during the discovery phase of their trial, Jamal ran out of that club like a man on fire. He sprinted down Fifth Avenue in the freezing New York rain, desperately trying to get back to the Plaza Hotel before the automated systems locked him out. He was entirely too late. Up in the $5,000 a night presidential suite, Vanessa lived her ultimate socialite fantasy. Lounging on the velvet sofa in a plush hotel bathrobe, she watched late-night television while eating a $60 room service fruit plate. She remained entirely oblivious that her husband had just confessed their crimes to a forensic accountant on a recorded line. Her blissful ignorance was shattered by 3 sharp, authoritative knocks on the heavy oak door. Vanessa assumed it was the concierge delivering the sparkling water they had demanded earlier. She casually tightened her robe, flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder, and swung the door open with a haughty expression. Her annoyed greeting died instantly in her throat. Standing in the softly lit hallway was not a bellhop. It was the Plaza night manager, an impeccably dressed man with rigid posture and an unamused expression. Flanking him were 2 uniformed officers from the New York Police Department. Vanessa stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest, before she could even process the terrifying sight of the police. The elevator chimed at the end of the hall. Jamal burst from the elevator doors completely out of breath, his expensive designer suit soaked from the rain and his eyes wide with absolute panic. He froze when he saw the officers standing outside their suite. The night manager stepped forward, addressing them both, with a voice entirely devoid of warmth. He informed them that the primary credit card placed on file for their deposit and incidentals had just been flagged by the Federal Fraud Division. The issuing bank had not only declined the authorization for their stay, but they had explicitly instructed the hotel to seize the physical card and notify local authorities of a suspected stolen identity in progress. Jamal frantically tried to smooth things over, falling back on his usual arrogant charm. He raised his hands defensively and stammered that it was simply a banking error, a massive misunderstanding with his corporate accountant back in Boston. He reached for his wallet to offer a different card, but his hands were shaking so violently he dropped his leather money clip onto the plush hallway carpet. The police officers were not impressed by his pathetic performance. One of the officers stepped forward, resting his hand casually on his heavy utility belt. He informed Jamal that every single financial account tied to his Social Security number had been frozen pending a federal inquiry. There were no backup credit cards. There was no secret cash reserve. They were currently trespassing in a 5-star hotel suite they had absolutely no legal ability to pay for. The night manager delivered the final non-negotiable ultimatum. They had exactly 10 minutes to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately. If they refused, or if they took a single item belonging to the hotel, the officers would arrest them on the spot for defrauding an innkeeper, a serious criminal offense in the state of New York. The next 10 minutes were a masterclass in pure humiliation. Vanessa began to sob hysterically, frantically, shoving her expensive cosmetics and designer clothes into her suitcase without bothering to fold them. Jamal was paralyzed by total shock, silently tossing his soaked shoes into a canvas duffel bag. They did not even have the necessary time to change out of their hotel sleepwear. When the 10 minutes were up, the officers escorted them out of the suite. Vanessa was still wearing her silk pajamas beneath her winter coat, her makeup smeared across her face in dark, ugly streaks. Jamal looked like a beaten dog. The officers marched them directly through the grand gilded lobby of the Plaza Hotel. It was late, but the lobby was still populated by wealthy, elegantly dressed guests returning from Broadway shows and late dinners. Everyone stopped and openly stared. The whispers echoed loudly off the marble walls. The golden child and the visionary entrepreneur were being paraded out of the most famous hotel in the world like common criminals. They were pushed out the heavy glass doors into the freezing, relentless Manhattan rain, entirely stripped of their stolen dignity and left with absolutely nothing. Since their primary accounts were frozen and their pockets were entirely empty, the harsh reality of the freezing Manhattan rain hit them immediately. They had no way to pay for a cab, let alone book a commercial airline flight. According to the furious voicemail my mother left me the next morning, Jamal had to humble himself and call a former college roommate he had previously cut off for not being wealthy enough. He begged the man to purchase 2 non-refundable Greyhound bus tickets back to Boston. The journey back was a grueling, humiliating nightmare. They dragged their expensive designer luggage through the muddy puddles of the Port Authority bus terminal at 3 in the morning. Vanessa, still shivering in her damp silk pajamas beneath her winter coat, was forced to sit in the cramped back row of a crowded bus right next to the bathroom. For 5 excruciating hours, they bumped along the interstate, surrounded by the exact type of working-class people they constantly mocked and belittled. The stark contrast between the $5,000 a night presidential suite and the sticky vinyl seats of a discount transit bus shattered whatever remained of Jamal's fragile ego. He did not speak a single word the entire trip. He just stared out the rain-streaked window, his jaw clenched, plotting his revenge against the sister he genuinely believed had ruined his magnificent life. They arrived in Boston just as the sun was coming up, exhausted, filthy, and entirely consumed by rage. They did not go back to their own rented apartment. Instead, they took a local transit train directly to my parents' house. Within minutes of walking through the front door, Vanessa collapsed into my mother's arms, sobbing hysterically and spinning a wild narrative of victimization. Jamal paced the living room, shouting that I had maliciously hacked into his business accounts out of pure spite. He claimed I was deliberately trying to steal their rightful inheritance and ruin his corporate reputation. Predictably, Susan and Richard swallowed every single lie without a second thought. They did not ask why the luxury hotel kicked them out or why the police were involved. They only saw their precious golden child suffering, and they immediately mobilized to destroy the person responsible. By 10 o'clock that morning, a furious war party was marching up the long, winding driveway of Grandpa Henry's, sprawling $1.5 million suburban estate. I was already there, having arrived early to review some final estate documents in a quiet environment. The morning air was crisp and clear, the storm from the previous day having finally passed. I was sitting on the back stone patio, overlooking the extensive gardens, peacefully enjoying a hot cup of espresso. The garden was perfectly silent until the sound of car doors violently slamming echoed from the front of the property. Heavy, angry footsteps stomped through the house. They did not bother knocking. They treated the estate as if they already owned it. The heavy glass patio doors were shoved open with such force they violently bounced off the exterior brick siding. Jamal marched out first, his ruined designer suit completely wrinkled and stained, looking like a deranged shadow of his former self. Vanessa followed closely behind, hiding her swollen, tear-streaked face behind large, dark sunglasses, gripping my mother's hand tightly for support. Richard brought up the rear, his face flushed with righteous indignation, ready to play the protective patriarch. I did not stand up. I did not flinch. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, letting the rich aroma fill the crisp air, and looked at the four of them over the rim of my cup. The visual contrast was almost comical. I was dressed in a crisp, tailored ivory sweater and slacks, completely serene while they looked like they had just survived a catastrophic shipwreck. "You vindictive, miserable psycho," Jamal spat, stepping so close to the wrought iron patio table that his knee hit the metal frame. His eyes were bloodshot and completely wild. "You think you won. You think you can just snap your fingers and take everything I have built." Susan pushed past him, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "How dare you, Rebecca? How absolutely dare you strand your own sister in New York like a common criminal? She is completely traumatized. You called the bank and lied to them just to ruin her trip. You are deeply sick." I slowly lowered my cup onto the matching ceramic saucer. The soft clink was the only noise in the garden for a brief second. "I did not strand anyone, Mother," I replied smoothly. "Federal banking algorithms did, and if you think a Greyhound bus ride was traumatizing you, are completely unprepared for what comes next." My father stepped right in front of Susan, his face contorted into a mask of pure authoritarian rage. He slammed his hand down on the back of a wrought iron patio chair, the metal scraping harshly against the stone floor. "Enough of your corporate riddles, Rebecca," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing across the expansive lawn. "I do not care about algorithms or whatever banking trick you use to inconvenience your sister. You are not the boss of this family. You are a guest in this house, and your welcome has officially expired." I remained seated, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. "I am a guest," I asked mildly. "Absolutely a guest," Richard declared, his chest puffed out in a ridiculous display of false dominance. "And you are currently trespassing." When Grandpa Henry was in the hospital last month, he made his final wishes extremely clear to me. He verbally promised this entire estate to Vanessa. He knew she and Jamal needed a solid foundation to build their future. This house is worth $1.5 million in pure equity. Jamal needs the deed immediately so he can leverage it as collateral for a commercial business loan. He is opening an exclusive restaurant downtown, and he needs this property to secure the financing. The sheer audacity of his statement was almost breathtaking. A verbal promise. My father was trying to claim a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate based on a fabricated conversation with a dying man. Furthermore, he was perfectly willing to let Jamal mortgage the family estate to the brink of foreclosure just to fund a restaurant venture that would inevitably fail within 6 months. Jamal stood behind my father, his posture suddenly straightening. The humiliating Greyhound bus ride faded from his memory as the prospect of acquiring a massive new asset breathed life back into his inflated ego. He crossed his arms and looked down his nose at me with a smug smirk. "You heard your father," Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The estate goes to the true heirs, the people who actually have the vision to multiply its value. We are taking possession of the property today, Rebecca. You need to pack your bags, hand over the security codes, and vacate the premises immediately." "And what if I refuse to pack my bags?" I asked calmly, taking another slow sip of my espresso. That was the exact moment Vanessa decided to escalate the situation from verbal threats to physical aggression. Emboldened by her husband's returning arrogance and our father's aggressive backing, she stomped past the patio table and marched directly into the house through the open glass doors. I turned my head just in time to see her walk straight into the formal living room where I had set up my temporary workspace. She was acting entirely like the new lady of the manor, completely consumed by her own toxic entitlement. "If you will not pack your own things, I will gladly do it for you," Vanessa shrieked. I watched calmly from the patio as my sister grabbed my tailored winter coat from the back of the sofa and forcefully hurled it across the room. It landed in a heap near the front hallway. Then she marched over to the antique mahogany desk where my professional equipment was laid out. She grabbed my leather briefcase, unceremoniously dumped its contents onto the expensive Persian rug, and kicked my folders toward the door. "Get out of my house, Rebecca!" Vanessa yelled, her voice bordering on hysterical. She reached for my silver laptop, her manicured fingers gripping the screen tight enough to crack the glass. "You ruined my trip to New York, so I am throwing you out on the street. You are just jealous because Grandpa Henry loved me more. He gave me this house because he knew you would just sit in it completely alone." Susan stood in the doorway watching her younger daughter vandalize my belongings with an expression of quiet approval. She genuinely believed Vanessa was simply claiming what was rightfully hers. Richard crossed his arms, looking at me with a stern, unforgiving glare. They were acting like wild dogs claiming a fresh kill, blind to the fact that they were standing on a trap door. I set my espresso cup down on the table. The sharp click of the ceramic against the saucer caused Jamal to flinch slightly. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my ivory sweater, completely unbothered by Vanessa's frantic tantrum. I walked slowly toward the glass doors, my posture perfectly straight, exuding a chilling, absolute authority. I smiled at my father, stepping past him into the formal living room to finally face my unhinged sister, entirely ready to end this charade once and for all. "Put the laptop down, Vanessa," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute freezing authority of a judge delivering a sentence. "Unless you want to add the destruction of corporate property and tampering with federal evidence to your growing list of felony charges, I suggest you take your hands off my computer right now." Vanessa froze. The sheer confidence in my tone pierced through her rage. Her manicured fingers loosened their grip. She slowly lowered the laptop back onto the antique desk, though she kept her chin raised in a pathetic attempt to maintain defiance. Richard and Jamal crowded into the doorway behind me. Jamal pointed a shaking finger at my head. "Stop threatening my wife and give us the security codes," he demanded, trying to regain control. "We need to get the property appraised by the end of the week for the commercial loan." I turned around to face them, my mother hovering anxiously in the hall. I looked at Jamal, letting my eyes travel up and down his ruined suit. "You want to use this estate as collateral for a commercial loan," I stated, repeating his ridiculous plan slowly. "You want to march into a bank and offer up Grandpa Henry's house to secure funding for a restaurant." "That is exactly what we are going to do," Richard interrupted, shielding Jamal. "You leverage existing assets to create capital. It is absolutely hilarious that you think any reputable bank would ever let Jamal leverage this property," I snapped back, "especially considering what happened 3 years ago." Jamal physically recoiled. His confident posture instantly crumbled. He darted a panicked glance at Vanessa, who looked completely confused by his sudden display of weakness. Susan and Richard exchanged blank stares across the room. They had no idea what I was talking about. Grandpa Henry had been entirely too ashamed of his mistake to tell them, and Jamal had been way too cowardly to ever confess his massive financial failure to his precious, adoring in-laws. "What are you talking about?" my father demanded, his voice losing its edge. "Let us take a walk down memory lane," I said. 3 years ago, Jamal came to Grandpa Henry with what he called a foolproof investment opportunity, a luxury car import business. He claimed he had buyers lined up and just needed capital to secure the first shipment. But Jamal had terrible credit and no cash. So he spent weeks in this very house emotionally manipulating an 80-year-old man. He convinced Grandpa to take out a massive second mortgage on this exact estate to fund the venture. "That was a legitimate business setback," Jamal stammered. "The overseas supplier defrauded me. It was not my fault." "There was no overseas supplier, Jamal," I corrected sharply. "I tracked the wire transfers. You funneled $600,000 of Grandpa Henry's home equity into a shell company, and then you blew it all on bad day trades, expensive dinners, and that ridiculous leased Porsche you drove to the cemetery yesterday. You gambled away a senior citizen's safety net." Susan gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. Vanessa slowly whipped her head around to stare at her husband in total disbelief. "And when the bank came collecting the monthly payments on that massive loan," I continued, stepping closer to Jamal, Grandpa Henry could not pay it. His fixed retirement income was not enough to cover the staggering debt you saddled him with. You nearly caused this entire estate to go into foreclosure. The bank was 60 days away from putting a padlock on that front door and throwing your beloved grandfather out onto the street. You are lying, Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling. Jamal would never do that. He absolutely did, I replied coldly, never breaking eye contact with Jamal. Grandpa was terrified. He was too ashamed to tell Richard and Susan because he knew they worshipped the ground Jamal walked on. So he called me. He sat in my office and cried because he thought he was going to lose the home he built with his own 2 hands. I turned back to my father, who was staring at Jamal with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. The golden facade of the brilliant provider was peeling away rapidly, revealing the desperate fraud underneath. So do not stand in this living room and lecture me about leveraging assets, I said to Richard, my voice dripping with absolute disdain. Jamal already leveraged this house to the brink of total financial ruin, and he would have successfully destroyed Grandpa Henry's entire legacy if I had not personally stepped in to fix his catastrophic, selfish mess right before the bank took everything away. Jamal stared at the hardwood floor, unable to meet the eyes of the family he had so thoroughly deceived. I did not give them any time to recover from the shock. I walked calmly over to the antique Persian rug where Vanessa had thrown my belongings just moments before. I knelt down with perfect composure, ignoring my sister's wide-eyed stare, and sifted through the scattered papers. I located exactly what I was looking for. It was a thick manila legal folder secured tightly with a red string tie. I picked it up, dusted off the cover, and stood back up to face my completely stunned family. "You see, Dad," I said, tapping the heavy folder against my palm. "A verbal promise from a dying man is a very sweet sentiment. It sounds wonderful in a eulogy, but in the real world, in the realm of federal law and real estate, a verbal promise is entirely worthless if the person making the promise does not actually own the asset they are trying to give away." Richard blinked, shaking his head as if trying to clear a dense fog. "What do you mean he did not own it? Henry bought this property 40 years ago. His name is on the deed." "His name was on the deed," I corrected him sharply. I untied the red string and pulled out a stack of crisp, watermarked legal documents. I held the papers up so the morning sunlight catching through the bay windows illuminated the official state seals. 3 years ago, when the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings because of Jamal's $600,000 theft, Grandpa Henry had exactly 0 options. He could not refinance. He could not declare bankruptcy without losing the estate. So I stepped in. Vanessa took a shaky step backward, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. "You paid off the loan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did not just pay off the loan, Vanessa," I said, offering her a cold, patronizing smile. "I am a forensic accountant. I do not throw good money into a black hole without securing a guaranteed return on my investment. I formed a limited liability company in the state of Massachusetts. I used my own personal capital to completely buy out the outstanding debt from the lending institution. In exchange for rescuing him from total financial ruin and public humiliation, Grandpa Henry signed a quitclaim deed." I separated the top document from the stack and tossed it onto the glass coffee table right in front of my father. Richard slowly leaned forward, his eyes scanning the bold black text at the top of the page. "Read it aloud, Dad," I commanded. Richard swallowed hard. His hands were trembling so badly he had to press them against his thighs to steady himself. "Property transfer," he read, his voice cracking. "Grantor Henry Davis, grantee Obsidian Financial Holdings Limited Liability Company." "And who is the sole managing member of Obsidian Financial Holdings?" I asked, my voice echoing in the silent room. Richard looked up, his face entirely drained of color. "You are," he whispered. "Exactly," I said, dropping the rest of the folder onto the table with a heavy thud. Grandpa Henry did not own this house when he died. He was merely a tenant living here rent-free out of the goodness of my heart. I own this property. I own the land it sits on. I own the roof over your heads. I hold the deed free and clear of any encumbrances. Your precious visionary husband cannot use this house as collateral for a commercial restaurant loan because Jamal does not own it. You cannot inherit it, Richard, because it was never part of the estate. And Vanessa certainly cannot kick me out of it. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The absolute certainty of their impending wealth evaporated into thin air. Vanessa looked around the luxurious living room as if the walls were suddenly closing in on her. Susan let out a soft, pathetic whimper, finally realizing that the daughter she had dismissed and belittled for her entire life was the only reason they even had a family home to stand in. I walked over to the front door and pulled it wide open, letting the crisp morning breeze sweep into the stifling room. I looked back at the four of them, my expression entirely devoid of sympathy. "You marched into my home," I stated, my voice ringing with finality. "You assaulted my property. You demanded my security codes. You are currently trespassing on private property owned by my corporation. I strongly suggest you pick up your bags and walk out that door before I call the local police and have you all arrested for breaking and entering. Leave now." The silence that followed my command was deafening. My father, Richard, stood frozen in the center of the living room, his mouth open as he stared at the legal documents resting on the glass coffee table. All the bluster and false authority he had carried into my home had vanished, replaced by the crushing realization that he had zero power here. Susan was trembling visibly, her eyes darting between me and the front door, finally grasping the severe legal reality of the situation. They had come to evict a tenant only to realize they were attempting to rob a landlord. But Jamal was not ready to surrender. The humiliation of the Greyhound bus ride, combined with the sudden death of his commercial restaurant dream, pushed him over the edge. His arrogance mutated into desperate aggression. He stepped over the scattered contents of my briefcase and marched directly toward me. He used his broad frame to crowd my personal space, attempting physical intimidation. "You are not keeping this house," Jamal snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I do not care what those papers say. Henry promised this property to Vanessa. You manipulated a sick old man into signing over the deed so you could steal our capital. You are going to sign a transfer document right now, or we are not leaving this room." Vanessa immediately rallied behind her husband, her earlier panic replaced by vicious energy. "He is right," she yelled, stepping up beside him. "You stole our inheritance. We are not going anywhere until you hand over that property." I did not step back. I did not break eye contact with Jamal for a single second. I stood my ground perfectly still, my breathing even and controlled. I had anticipated this exact escalation. When dealing with entitled individuals who suddenly lose their unearned privileges, they always resort to threats. "I gave you a chance to leave with a shred of dignity," I said evenly. "But since you insist on doing this the hard way, let me introduce you to the upgrades I made to this property." I reached into the pocket of my ivory slacks and pulled out my car keys. Attached to the silver ring was a heavy black fob. Without breaking my gaze away from Jamal's furious eyes, I pressed my thumb down hard on the red panic button in the center of the device. Instantly, a piercing siren erupted from the ceiling speakers hidden throughout the entire estate. The sheer volume of the alarm was physically painful, rattling the antique windows. A harsh strobe light began flashing in the main hallway. Over the deafening wail of the siren, an automated female voice broadcasted through the intercom system. "Intruder alert! Perimeter breach detected. Law enforcement dispatch initiated. Police are en route." Susan let out a genuine scream of terror, covering her ears with both hands. Richard physically jumped backward, nearly knocking over a floor lamp in his panic. The blaring alarm shattered Jamal's aggressive facade. He stumbled away from me, his eyes wide with fear, as the automated voice repeated the warning. He knew exactly what would happen if the authorities arrived, especially with the federal fraud alerts attached to his identity from the New York hotel incident. "Are you insane?" Richard shouted over the noise, grabbing Susan's arm and pulling her toward the open front door. "Turn that off. You have exactly 3 minutes before the armed patrol cars pull into the long driveway. I shouted back over the alarm. "I suggest you start running." That was all it took. Thigh. The fight completely drained out of them. Vanessa tripped over her own feet as she sprinted toward the door, leaving her coat behind. Jamal followed closely behind her, his head on a swivel, terrified that a police cruiser was already turning onto the street. Richard paused at the threshold, his face purple with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me from the porch. "You think you are so smart with your corporate tricks," he yelled over the siren. "Enjoy your empty house, Rebecca, because the official will, reading with Attorney Caldwell, is on Thursday." Grandpa Henry had $5 million in liquid assets. When Vanessa gets her hands on that trust fund, she is going to buy a house 10 times bigger than this. We will destroy you in probate court. He turned and fled down the driveway, joining his wife, his golden child daughter, and his completely fraudulent son-in-law. I watched them scramble into their vehicle and speed away just as I canceled the alarm. The house fell completely silent once again. They were clinging to the desperate hope of a $5 million inheritance. They had no idea Thursday was going to be the worst day of their miserable lives. 2 days later, Thursday morning arrived with a crisp chill, matching my family's impending destruction. The official reading of Grandpa Henry's estate was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp at attorney Thomas Caldwell's downtown Boston law firm. Caldwell was a brilliant estate lawyer and a close personal friend of my grandfather for 3 decades. We had spent 2 years meticulously bulletproofing the estate's financial architecture, preparing specifically for the greed about to walk through his doors. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in a sharp charcoal gray business suit. Caldwell met me in the sleek lobby, offering a brief knowing nod. We did not need to review the strategy. The legal trap was set, the paperwork ironclad, and federal authorities were already quietly monitoring the fallout from the New York wire transfer incident. We just had to let them read the menu before handing them the massive bill. At 9:55, the elevator doors chimed, and my family stepped into the quiet reception area. If I had not known they were drowning in frozen assets and maxed-out credit cards, I might have been fooled. They walked in acting like modern royalty arriving to claim their kingdom. Jamal led the pack, wearing an aggressively tailored navy blue designer suit and a flashy gold watch, screaming financial insecurity. Since his primary business accounts were locked by federal fraud algorithms, that suit was either purchased on a high-interest credit card or hastily rented. He adjusted his silk tie with a smug flick of his wrist, his posture completely devoid of the terrified panic he had displayed in my living room 48 hours prior. He was running entirely on the delusional high of the upcoming $5 million payout. Vanessa walked right beside him, draped in a conspicuous beige cashmere coat over a pristine white dress. She carried a massive leather handbag, prominently displaying a luxury logo, stepping onto the polished marble floors with the haughty confidence of a woman who fully believed she was about to become a multi-millionaire. She had apparently scrubbed the memory of being escorted out of the Plaza Hotel in her pajamas by the police. Today she was playing the triumphant air, ready to accept her unearned fortune. My parents, Susan and Richard, followed closely behind them like loyal subjects. Richard wore his best Sunday suit, his chest puffed out in ridiculous pride. Susan was practically vibrating with excitement, whispering conspiratorially to Vanessa and patting Jamal's shoulder with absolute adoration. They looked at the expensive modern art on the walls and the sweeping views of the Boston skyline as if they were already shopping for a new lifestyle. When they spotted me sitting quietly on a leather sofa in the corner of the waiting room, their smug expressions intensified. Richard offered a cold, dismissive scoff, adjusting his jacket as if my presence was a minor, unpleasant odor he simply had to endure for a few more minutes. Jamal smirked, leaning over to whisper something in Vanessa's ear that made her let out a sharp, mocking laugh. They genuinely believed that the incident at the house was just a temporary setback. They thought I had won a minor battle over a suburban property, but they were here to win the ultimate war. Grandpa Henry was an incredibly successful man, and they knew his impressive liquid assets, his vast stock portfolios, his tax-free municipal bonds, and his high-yield savings accounts totaled well over $5 million. In their greedy minds, the $1.5 million house was just an appetizer. The $5 million trust was the main course, and they were ready to feast. Attorney Caldwell's assistant, a polite young woman with a stern expression, walked into the reception area and gestured toward the heavy double doors of the main boardroom. She announced that Mr. Caldwell was ready for us. Jamal immediately stepped forward, rudely cutting off another attorney who was trying to reach the exit, and marched into the boardroom as if his name was already painted on the building. Vanessa followed with her nose held high in the air, her cashmere coat sweeping dramatically behind her. Susan and Richard eagerly brought up the rear of the procession, not even bothering to cast a single glance in my direction. I stood up slowly, smoothing the tailored jacket of my charcoal gray suit. I picked up my leather briefcase, taking a deep, calming breath. The arrogance they were displaying was exactly what made this so incredibly satisfying. They were marching eagerly toward the edge of a massive cliff, completely blind to the drop. I followed them into the cold, silent boardroom, taking my seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, ready to watch their entire world burn to the ground. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind us, sealing the room in absolute quiet. Attorney Caldwell sat at the head of the massive conference table, his silver pen resting neatly next to a thick leather portfolio. I chose the chair at the farthest end, placing my briefcase softly on the polished wood. My family, functioning as a single toxic organism, clustered together directly across from Caldwell. Vanessa took the seat of honor, draping her cashmere coat over the expensive leather chair. Jamal sat to her right, aggressively claiming space by spreading his arms wide. My parents flanked them like loyal bodyguards, vibrating with greedy anticipation. The silence in the room was not mourning. It was the breathless silence of people waiting for a winning lottery ticket to be validated. Before Caldwell could even open his mouth to offer formal condolences, Vanessa leaned forward. She folded her manicured hands on the table and looked directly down the length of the mahogany wood at me. Her lips curled into a nasty, triumphant smirk. She was completely unable to contain her gloating for even 1 minute. She had to twist the knife before the reading began. "I hope you are prepared for reality today," Rebecca Vanessa stated, her voice echoing sharply. "Because being a boring forensic accountant is not going to save you from being written out of this family legacy. You spent the last 2 years hovering around Grandpa Henry like a vulture, auditing his grocery bills and trying to control his life. You actually thought calculating his taxes would make him love you more. But Grandpa was a man of vision, and he knew exactly who actually had a bright future." She paused, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder, bathing in the attention of the room. Caldwell watched her with a completely unreadable expression, his hands folded over his legal pad. "You can keep that stupid suburban house," Vanessa continued, her tone dripping with venom. "You can lock yourself inside and count your pennies alone. But the real family legacy, the wealth that actually matters, belongs to us. Grandpa always told me I was the absolute light of his life. He knew Jamal and I were destined for greatness. He knew we needed serious capital to build an empire. He is going to write you completely out of this family today, and honestly, it is exactly what you deserve for stranding me in New York." My mother, Susan, let out a soft, dramatic sigh of agreement. She reached over and began affectionately stroking Jamal's tailored shoulder. She looked at her son-in-law as if he had personally invented the concept of wealth. "Vanessa is absolutely right," Susan cooed, her eyes shining with tears of pure greed. "Grandpa Henry recognized true potential when he saw it. Jamal is the true heir to the Davis family legacy. He is the one who will take this family name into the next generation of massive wealth. You have always been so incredibly jealous of his entrepreneurial spirit, Rebecca. You just crunch numbers in a cubicle, but Jamal is actually building something real. Today is the day this family finally stops letting your bitter jealousy hold us back." My father, Richard, nodded firmly, crossing his arms over his chest. Henry knew what he was doing. Richard added, his voice thick with unearned pride. He knew you lacked the vision to handle real money, Rebecca. You would just let it stagnate in a bank vault. Jamal knows how to leverage capital. Jamal puffed out his chest, soaking up my parents' praise like a dying plant absorbing water. He shot me an arrogant look, silently promising that my days of disrespecting him were permanently over. He was genuinely convinced that the $5 million sitting in my grandfather's accounts would instantly wipe away his federal wire fraud charges, his frozen bank accounts, and his humiliating police eviction. He was completely delusional. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the cool wood of the conference table. I did not interrupt Vanessa's pathetic monologue. I did not defend my highly successful career or my genuine relationship with my grandfather. I watched them with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing an aggressive strain of bacteria under a microscope. I let them talk. I let them build their magnificent castles in the sky. The higher they built their fragile delusions, the more devastating the impact would be when gravity took over. Attorney Caldwell cleared his throat, breaking the toxic spell my family had cast over the room. He reached out and placed his hand flat against the thick leather portfolio. The time for their pathetic and arrogant monologues was officially over. The execution was ready to commence, and I was eager to witness their total financial ruin. Attorney Caldwell broke the heavy silence by opening the thick leather portfolio resting on the mahogany table. The crisp sound of the heavy paper turning echoed in the large boardroom. He adjusted his silver-framed reading glasses and looked directly at my father, bypassing Jamal and Vanessa entirely. The lawyerly detachment in his eyes was absolute. "Thank you all for coming this morning," Caldwell began, his voice projecting with practiced authority. "We are here to discuss the final estate of Henry Davis. I know many of you have come with certain expectations regarding the timeline and the legal process of probate court. I also understand that Richard, as Henry's only son, anticipated being named the primary executor of a standard last will and testament." Richard sat up straighter, adjusting his tie. "Yes, Thomas. We are ready to get the paperwork filed with the city so we can expedite the release of the funds. Jamal and Vanessa have immediate capital requirements for their new business ventures." Caldwell did not even blink. He simply turned to the first page of the document. "There will be no filings with the city," Richard Caldwell stated plainly, "and there will be no probate court proceedings. In fact, Henry Davis did not leave a traditional last will and testament." The smug smile completely vanished from Vanessa's face. Jamal leaned forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean there is no will?" Jamal demanded, his aggressive tone slipping back into his voice. "Everyone has a will. He had over $5 million in liquid assets. You cannot just tell us the money vanished." "The money has certainly not vanished," Caldwell replied, unbothered by Jamal's outburst. "But a standard will is a public document subject to the lengthy and often contested probate process. Henry wanted to ensure his assets were protected with absolute ironclad certainty. Therefore, 2 years ago, with the professional assistance of a certified forensic accountant, Henry established an irrevocable living trust." Susan gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "An irrevocable trust," she repeated, the legal term sounding entirely foreign and terrifying on her tongue. "Yes," Susan Caldwell continued smoothly. "An irrevocable living trust is a separate legal entity. The moment Henry signed the documents 2 years ago, he technically ceased to own his $5 million in liquid assets. The money was transferred entirely into the ownership of the trust. Because the trust owned the assets prior to his death, there is absolutely nothing for a probate judge to review. The distribution is private, immediate, and legally untouchable. Furthermore, because it is irrevocable, it cannot be altered or contested by disgruntled relatives." The air in the boardroom suddenly felt incredibly thin. The reality of the legal fortress I had built for my grandfather was finally crashing down on them. They had spent the last 3 days fantasizing about dragging me through court, tying up the assets, and using their status as immediate family to force a settlement. Now Caldwell was calmly informing them that the court system was completely locked out. There was no judge to manipulate. There was no legal loophole for Jamal's imaginary lawyers to exploit. But we are his direct bloodline. Richard stammered, his face turning a pale, sickly shade of gray. The trust has to distribute the funds to the surviving family members. That is how these things work. Read the distribution, Thomas. Tell us what my father left us. Caldwell adjusted his glasses again, looking down at the heavy parchment paper. Very well. As the legally appointed trustee, I am bound to execute the exact terms laid out in this document. The trust currently holds $5.2 million in various liquid accounts. The distribution directives are explicitly clear and leave zero room for interpretation. Jamal grabbed Vanessa's hand, gripping it so tightly, her knuckles turned white. They leaned forward, literally holding their breath, waiting for the massive payday they believed would save them from their federal crimes. To my son, Richard Davis Caldwell, read his voice steady and devoid of emotion. I leave the sum of exactly $1. Richard's jaw dropped open. He let out a strangled sound as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from his lungs. To my daughter-in-law, Susan Davis Caldwell, continued, ignoring my father's shock. I leave the sum of exactly $1. To my granddaughter, Vanessa Davis, I also leave the sum of exactly $1. Silence. Complete paralyzing silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The grand, magnificent castle in the sky they had been building all morning instantly detonated. They expected a massive windfall to fund their extravagant lifestyle. Instead, they were handed a single crumpled dollar bill. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate and profoundly humiliating insult from beyond the grave. Richard was the first to break the paralyzing silence. He slammed his hands against the table, pushing himself up from his heavy chair. His face flushed a deep, violent shade of red. $1! Richard shouted, the sound echoing off the wood-paneled walls of the boardroom. Are you out of your mind, Thomas? This is a massive mistake. My father had over $5 million. I am his only son. Vanessa is his favorite grandchild. You read that document wrong, or she forged it. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. Attorney Caldwell did not flinch or raise his voice. He simply adjusted his glasses, looking at my father with the tired patience of a man who had explained this legal reality to dozens of greedy relatives. I assure you, Richard, there is no mistake, and there is absolutely no forgery, Caldwell replied smoothly. Henry sat in this exact room 2 years ago and personally dictated these terms while of completely sound mind. He was evaluated by 2 independent medical professionals on the day of the signing to ensure his cognitive clarity could never be questioned in a court of law. He wanted to leave you exactly $1. Vanessa let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, gripping her designer handbag tight. This is a joke, she stammered, looking frantically between Jamal and my mother. You cannot just leave someone $1. It is completely meaningless. We are going to sue. Jamal, tell him we are calling our lawyers right now. We will tie this entire estate up in litigation for the next decade if we have to. We will drain every single penny of that $5 million in legal fees before we let Rebecca take it. Jamal nodded vigorously, his arrogance flaring at the prospect of a legal battle. He pulled out his phone, ready to play the role of the powerful businessman. I strongly advise against making any phone calls, Jamal. Caldwell interrupted, his voice suddenly dropping to a freezing, authoritative tone. Because you clearly do not understand the legal mechanism at play here. Leaving you $1 was not merely a symbolic insult. It was a highly calculated legal strategy known as a no contest clause or an in terrorem clause under Massachusetts state law. Susan looked confused, darting her eyes nervously. What does that mean? She asked softly. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, deciding to take over the explanation. I wanted to look directly into their eyes as I closed the steel trap around them. It means I anticipated your exact reaction, Vanessa, I said, my voice perfectly calm. In probate law, if a direct relative is left entirely out of a will or trust, they can easily file a lawsuit claiming they were accidentally forgotten by the deceased. but by explicitly naming you Richard and Susan in the trust document and leaving you exactly $1, Grandpa Henry legally proved that he did not forget you. He considered you perfectly, and he deliberately decided your overall worth to his legacy was exactly 100 pennies. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The insult finally landed, stripping away her golden child armor completely. But the no contest clause goes much further than that, Caldwell added, picking up where I left off. The clause explicitly states that if any beneficiary attempts to challenge the validity of this trust in court, they automatically forfeit their inheritance, and more importantly, the contesting party will be held entirely financially responsible for all legal fees incurred by the trust to defend against the lawsuit. Richard sank back into his chair, the fight completely draining out of his posture. He was not a wealthy man. He was a man who lived paycheck to paycheck to maintain the illusion of upper-middle-class success. "Let me make this perfectly clear for you, Dad," I said, leaning back in my chair. "If you try to sue me for the $5 million, you will absolutely lose, because this document is bulletproof. And when the judge dismisses your frivolous lawsuit, you will be legally mandated to pay my attorney fees. My corporate lawyers charge $800 an hour. A prolonged legal battle will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Since you do not have that kind of money, the court will place liens on your personal retirement accounts, your cars, and whatever meager savings you have left. You will bankrupt yourself trying to fight me." The devastation hitting my parents was absolute and immediate. Susan began to weep silently, the tears ruining her carefully applied makeup. Richard stared blankly at the single crumpled dollar bill Caldwell had placed on the table. They were finally completely and utterly trapped by their own greed. Jamal was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. The realization that the $5 million was permanently out of reach did not humble him in the slightest. Instead of accepting reality, it ignited a frantic, explosive rage. He abruptly pushed himself up from his leather chair, planting both of his hands firmly on the polished mahogany table. He leaned across the wide surface, his eyes wide and bloodshot, zeroing in on me with a look of pure, unadulterated panic. The carefully constructed facade of the wealthy entrepreneur was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate flailing of a man drowning in his own catastrophic mistakes. "Fine!" Jamal screamed, the sheer volume of his voice making Susan jump in her seat. "Keep your stupid trust fund. Keep the house. I do not care about the $5 million anymore. But you are going to pick up your phone right now and call the bank, Rebecca. You are going to authorize the release of the $300,000 we transferred on Tuesday. That money was in a separate checking account. It was not in this fancy, irrevocable trust. Grandpa Henry kept that cash entirely liquid, and Vanessa had the legal authority to move it. It belongs to us, and I need it unfrozen immediately." He was practically hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he laid out his pathetic demands. He was publicly admitting to the unauthorized transfer right in front of the estate attorney, too blinded by his massive debts to realize how thoroughly he was incriminating himself. "My business accounts are completely locked," Jamal continued to yell, his voice cracking with hysteria. "My credit lines are maxed out. I have investors threatening to sue me by the end of the very week. You put a fraud alert on that transfer out of pure spite, and you are destroying my livelihood. Call the bank and clear the hold now, or I swear I will make your life a living nightmare." I did not reach for my phone. I did not shrink back from his aggressive posture. Instead, I slowly leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the physical distance between us. I looked at his sweaty, panicked face, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. This was the moment I had been waiting for since I washed that teacup in the kitchen. I let the silence stretch for 5 long seconds, allowing his frantic breathing to fill the quiet boardroom. Attorney Caldwell simply watched, his hands folded neatly over his legal pad, knowing exactly what I was about to say. "You are absolutely correct about one thing, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, icy whisper that commanded total attention. "That checking account was not part of the irrevocable trust. It was kept entirely separate for a very specific reason. But you are completely wrong about who that money actually belonged to. You assumed it was Grandpa Henry's personal spending cash. You thought it was just a forgotten pile of wealth sitting there waiting for Vanessa to log in and steal it. You thought you outsmarted everyone by bypassing the estate lawyers and taking it directly. Vanessa stopped crying and looked up, her mascara-smeared eyes darting between me and her husband. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with fresh terror. "Whose money was it?" I turned my gaze to my sister, offering her the coldest smile I could muster. "It was not Grandpa's money, Vanessa. When you establish a massive trust and transfer millions of dollars in assets, it triggers significant tax liabilities. As his financial advisor and the executor of his estate, it was my legal responsibility to ensure those obligations were met. That specific bank account was not a personal checking account. It was a highly dedicated, legally binding escrow account." I turned my attention back to Jamal, watching the color drain entirely from his face as my words slowly penetrated his thick skull. That $300,000 was carefully calculated and set aside specifically to pay Grandpa Henry's federal estate taxes. That money belonged directly to the Internal Revenue Service. When you used Vanessa's expired password to wire those funds to New York, you did not just steal from me. You did not just steal from your family. You reached directly into the pockets of the United States Treasury. You used stolen federal tax dollars to book a presidential suite at the Plaza Hotel. I concluded, delivering the absolute kill shot with deliberate, devastating precision. You used government money to buy champagne and fund your fraudulent business accounts. You committed federal wire fraud and tax evasion. I did not freeze your bank accounts, Jamal. The federal government did. And they do not simply unfreeze accounts when you ask nicely. They send federal agents. Jamal staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His shoulders slumped and his hands trembled violently by his sides. He looked at Vanessa, but she was frozen in her leather chair, her face ashen, staring at me with a look of absolute terror. "You are lying," Jamal whispered, though the complete lack of conviction in his voice proved he already knew the truth. "It was just a checking account. You cannot prove it was earmarked for taxes. You are just trying to scare us." "I do not have to prove anything, Jamal," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands on the mahogany table. "The paperwork proves it. Attorney Caldwell filed the preliminary estate tax documents 3 weeks ago. The Internal Revenue Service had a registered legal lien on that specific account. Every single dollar was itemized, accounted for, and scheduled for electronic withdrawal. When you logged in and transferred that money, the federal banking system automatically flagged the routing numbers. You literally stole from the United States Treasury." Susan began to cry, burying her face in her trembling hands. Richard stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. "Do you have any idea how the Criminal Investigation Division operates?" I asked, my voice echoing in the room. "They do not negotiate. They do not care about your fabricated logistics empire or your need to portray a wealthy lifestyle on social media. When they see $300,000 of federal tax funds wired across state lines to a private business account, they do not just freeze the money. They initiate a full forensic audit of your entire life. They are currently pulling every tax return you have ever filed, every credit card statement you possess, and every bank record tied to your social security number." Vanessa let out a strangled sob, her hands shaking. "Rebecca, please!" she begged, her haughty demeanor entirely shattered. "We will give it back. We will call the bank and return the money today. Just tell them it was a mistake. Tell them Grandpa gave us permission before he died." "You cannot return money you have already spent, Vanessa," I pointed out. "You spent $5,000 on a hotel suite. You bought expensive vintage champagne. You purchased plane tickets and designer clothes. You commingled federal funds with your own personal debt. The crime is already complete, and even if you had every single penny sitting untouched, returning stolen government property does not magically erase the felony of taking it in the first place." Jamal suddenly lunged forward toward the heavy mahogany doors. His survival instinct had finally kicked in, overriding his arrogance. He realized that sitting in a lawyer's office in downtown Boston was the worst place to be if the federal government was actively looking for him. "We need to leave," Jamal ordered, frantically grabbing Vanessa's arm and pulling her out of her leather chair. "Get your coat, Vanessa. We are leaving right now. We need to hire a defense attorney immediately." But before Jamal could turn the brass handle, a heavy rhythmic thud echoed from the corridor outside. It was the distinct sound of multiple footsteps marching down the hardwood floor of the law firm. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the thick wooden doors of the boardroom. Attorney Caldwell calmly closed his leather portfolio and set his silver pen down on the table. He looked at my parents, who were clinging to each other in sheer panic. "I am afraid nobody is leaving this room," Caldwell announced quietly. The heavy brass handle turned slowly from the outside. The massive mahogany doors swung open wide. Standing in the threshold were 4 individuals who permanently ended Jamal's empire. 2 tall men in dark suits stepped into the boardroom. They wore silver badges clipped to their belts and carried thick manila folders. Behind them stood 2 uniformed officers from the Boston Police Department, their hands resting on their duty belts. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with gray hair and cold, calculating eyes, scanned the entire room. His gaze instantly locked onto Jamal, who had backed away from the door and was pressing himself against the conference table. "Jamal," the federal agent asked loudly, his voice completely devoid of any human emotion whatsoever. Jamal could not speak a single word. He nodded, his entire body shaking. "I am Special Agent Thompson with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division," the man stated, pulling a document from his jacket pocket. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest, along with a warrant for the arrest of Vanessa. You are both being charged with wire fraud, grand larceny, and felony tax evasion." Vanessa screamed loudly, a chilling sound of absolute, complete despair echoing off the walls. Vanessa's scream pierced the heavy silence of the boardroom, a raw, guttural sound of pure terror that bounced off the polished mahogany walls. She stumbled backward, her expensive beige cashmere coat slipping from her shoulders and falling in a careless heap onto the floor. The 2 uniformed officers from the Boston Police Department did not hesitate. They moved with practiced, terrifying efficiency, stepping around the large conference table to flank my sister and her husband. Jamal pressed himself completely flat against the wall, his hands raised in the air, as if he were trying to physically surrender to the wood paneling. The arrogant, wealthy entrepreneur who had marched into this office demanding millions of dollars was entirely gone. In his place stood a trembling, pathetic man who was finally facing the severe consequences of his own boundless greed. Special Agent Thompson stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He grabbed Jamal's right wrist, twisting it behind his back with a swift, uncompromising motion. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place sounded louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. "Jamal, you have the right to remain silent." Agent Thompson began, his voice a steady, emotionless drone that cut through Vanessa's continued hysterical sobbing. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." While Thompson secured Jamal, the second federal agent grabbed Vanessa's arm. She fought back instinctively, thrashing her shoulders and screaming for our mother to help her. Susan lunged forward from her chair, her hands outstretched toward her golden child, tears streaming down her face. "Stop it! You are hurting her!" Susan shrieked desperately, trying to grab the agent's arm. "She is a good girl. She did not mean to do anything wrong. Richard, do something!" My father stood frozen, his chest heaving, completely impotent in the face of federal law enforcement. He took one hesitant step forward, but the Boston police officer immediately placed a firm hand on the butt of his service weapon, shooting Richard a glare that instantly rooted him to the spot. Richard raised his hands in surrender, stepping back and letting his favorite daughter be restrained. The second agent locked the cuffs around Vanessa's delicate wrists, entirely ignoring her designer dress and her frantic pleas. She was read her Miranda rights in the same cold, clinical tone. The reality of the situation was absolute. There were no negotiations. There was no leveraging of assets. The federal government had arrived to collect its dues, and they were taking their payment in years of freedom. That was the exact moment Jamal's survival instinct completely overrode his marital loyalty. He looked down at his cuffed hands, then looked at the federal agents, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. He knew he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He knew his fake empire was entirely destroyed, and he decided instantly that he was not going down alone. It was her. Jamal suddenly screamed, his voice cracking as he violently twisted his body to point his cuffed hands directly at his crying wife. It was Vanessa. She is the one who did it. I did not touch the money. I did not initiate the transfer. Vanessa stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, her head snapping up to stare at her husband in absolute stunned disbelief. Susan gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She took the tablet. Jamal continued to yell, his words spilling out in a desperate, pathetic rush to save himself. Vanessa took Grandpa Henry's tablet from his nightstand right after he died. She knew his passwords. She bragged about knowing his security questions. She logged into the banking portal while we were driving to the airport. I told her it was a bad idea, but she said it was her rightful inheritance. She wired the funds to my account without my permission. I am the victim here. The absolute betrayal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The grand romance, the power couple aesthetic they had aggressively shoved in my face for 5 years, evaporated in less than 30 seconds under the pressure of federal indictments. Jamal was eagerly throwing the love of his life under the bus to shave a few years off his impending sentence. Vanessa stared at him, her mascara running down her pale cheeks in thick black rivers. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice completely broken. "You told me to do it. You said we needed the money for the hotel." "I never said that," Jamal roared back, his face contorted. "You are a selfish thief, Vanessa. You ruined my life." The two federal agents were completely unfazed by the sudden vicious domestic dispute erupting right in front of them. They had seen co-conspirators turn on each other countless times before. Agent Thompson simply grabbed Jamal by the bicep and forcibly marched him toward the heavy mahogany doors. The Boston police officers followed closely behind, practically dragging a completely hysterical Vanessa. Her expensive designer shoes scraped against the polished hardwood floor, her cries for our mother growing fainter as they were escorted down the long corridor toward the freight elevator. The heavy boardroom doors swung shut with a solid, echoing click. Suddenly, the expansive room felt entirely empty. The chaotic, aggressive energy that Jamal and Vanessa had brought into the law firm was permanently gone, replaced by the suffocating weight of federal consequences. Attorney Caldwell let out a long, quiet sigh and adjusted his silver glasses. He methodically gathered his legal documents, offering me a brief, respectful nod. He knew his part in this grand performance was over. My parents, however, were just beginning their desperate second act. Susan collapsed into the leather chair Vanessa had just vacated. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she sobbed. Richard stood frozen near the edge of the conference table, staring blankly at the brass door handle. The golden child was gone. The visionary entrepreneur was in handcuffs. The $5 million inheritance was a complete illusion. All that remained was the daughter they had spent 33 years belittling, entirely untouched by the destruction around her. It took exactly 60 seconds for their survival instinct to completely override their foolish pride. Richard slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes, previously filled with arrogant disdain, were now wide with absolute begging desperation. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving. He took a hesitant step toward my end of the table. Susan lifted her tear-stained face, her smeared makeup making her look incredibly fragile and entirely pathetic. She scrambled out of her chair and practically ran toward me, stopping just short of falling to her knees on the floor. "Rebecca, please." Susan pleaded, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "You have to help us. You have to save your sister. She is not built for jail. She will not survive in a federal holding cell. They are going to lock her away with actual criminals. You saw how terrified she was. You have to do something right now." I remained seated, resting my hands perfectly still on the mahogany table. "What exactly would you like me to do, Mother?" I asked, my voice flat and devoid of any comforting warmth. "I am a forensic accountant, not a federal judge. Your daughter committed wire fraud. You control the trust fund." Richard interjected, his voice rising in panic as he rushed over to stand beside his weeping wife. "Thomas just said it. You are the trustee. The money is sitting right there in those accounts. We need cash right now, Rebecca. We need to hire a top-tier criminal defense attorney immediately, and we need to post her bail. A federal bond for wire fraud and tax evasion is going to be massive. We need at least $100,000 transferred to our personal checking account by the end of the business day so we can get her out tonight." I stared at him, genuinely marveling at the sheer audacity required to make such a demand. Less than 15 minutes ago, they were cheering for Vanessa as she gleefully promised to write me out of the family legacy. They had stood in my living room and tried to forcefully evict me from my own property. Now they were demanding a six-figure handout from the exact same assets they had just tried to steal. "We are your parents, Rebecca," Susan cried out, reaching across the table to grab my forearm. I smoothly pulled my arm back, refusing to let her touch me. Her hand dropped awkwardly to the polished wood. "Please do not be cruel," Susan begged. "We know we have had our differences. We know we said some harsh things at the funeral. But this is different. This is about family survival. We are blood. And when things get this bad, family sticks together. You cannot just abandon your own flesh and blood to the federal prison system." "Family sticks together," I repeated slowly, letting the pathetic phrase hang in the cold air of the boardroom. "Yes," Richard insisted, his eyes wild with desperate hope. "We forgive you for the misunderstanding with the house. We forgive you for freezing the bank accounts. We can put all of this ugly business behind us. Just authorize the bail money transfer today and save her." I looked at my father, letting the absurdity of his words hang in the heavy air. "You forgive me," I repeated slowly, my voice devoid of emotion. "You are standing in a downtown law firm, freshly stripped of a $5 million inheritance, watching your golden child be hauled away by federal agents for stealing from the United States Treasury, and you actually have the unmitigated gall to stand there and say you forgive me." Richard blinked rapidly, his desperate expression faltering. "Rebecca, please," he stammered, taking a hesitant step backward. "I just meant we need to move forward. We need to focus on Vanessa right now. We need to be a family." I shifted my gaze away and looked down at my mother. Susan was still leaning across the polished mahogany table, her tear-stained face pleading for a miraculous financial rescue. She looked incredibly small, stripped of the arrogant superiority she had worn like a crown for my entire life. She was waiting for the obedient, desperate for approval daughter to emerge from the shadows and fix her massive problems. That fragile daughter died a long time ago. "Mother, do you remember what you said to me at Grandpa Henry's funeral reception?" I asked, keeping my posture straight and my voice level. "Do you remember standing in the parlor telling me how incredibly proud you were of Vanessa? You called her your greatest achievement. You told me she and Jamal were building a real empire while I was just a bitter accountant who only knew how to crunch numbers behind a desk." Susan swallowed hard, her eyes darting away in sudden shame. "I was just upset," she whispered defensively. "I was grieving. People say things they do not mean when they are grieving." "You meant every single syllable," I corrected her sharply. "And you said something else to Uncle Gregory later that afternoon. You told him investing your time and energy into Vanessa was the best investment you ever made. You proudly declared Vanessa was your ultimate retirement plan." Susan flinched violently, as if I had physically struck her across the face. The memory of her own toxic words echoing back in her darkest hour was clearly agonizing. Well, Mother, I continued, my voice dropping to a chilling whisper that commanded the entire room. I am a financial expert, and I am here to tell you your primary portfolio has officially crashed. You poured all your love, your financial resources, and your blind loyalty into a selfish, entitled criminal who just stole $300,000 from the federal government to buy vintage champagne. Now you are begging me to liquidate the trust fund I built to bail out your failed asset. Richard slammed his fist against the table, his irrational anger returning. She is your sister, he roared, his face turning red again. How can you be so incredibly cold and heartless? We need $100,000 right now, or she goes to a holding cell tonight. You are not getting a single dime, I stated, my voice ringing with unshakable finality. You are not getting $100,000. You are not even getting the single $1 bill Attorney Caldwell placed on this table. That money legally belongs to the irrevocable trust. As the appointed trustee, I have a strict fiduciary duty to protect those assets from being wasted on federal bail bonds for admitted felons. Susan let out a loud, pathetic wail, covering her face with her hands. What are we going to do? She sobbed, rocking back and forth. We cannot afford a top-tier federal defense attorney. I suggest you figure out how to leverage your existing assets, Dad, I said, turning my cold gaze back to my father. You were so eager to mortgage my suburban house to fund Jamal's fake restaurant. Call your own bank and see exactly how much equity you have left in your retirement accounts. Sell your cars. Downsize your comfortable lifestyle. You can finally pay the agonizing price for enabling her terrible behavior for the last 30 years. Rebecca, you cannot do this to us, Richard pleaded, crushing defeat replacing his anger. We will lose everything trying to keep her out of federal prison. Then you will lose everything, I replied calmly, picking up my leather briefcase. I set an ironclad boundary with this family the exact moment Jamal and Vanessa decided to treat Grandpa Henry like a personal automated teller machine. I am completely finished bailing you out of the disasters you created. Good luck getting your return on investment from a federal penitentiary. I turned my back on my weeping parents, completely unaffected by their overwhelming despair. The toxic chains they had wrapped around my life for 3 decades were finally and permanently broken. I stepped out of the boardroom into the long carpeted corridor, just as the freight elevator finally chimed at the far end of the hall. Agent Thompson and his partner were waiting for the heavy metal elevator doors to slide open, keeping a firm grip on a panicking Jamal. Vanessa was slumped against the wall, weeping uncontrollably while the local police officers stood guard. My parents scrambled out of the boardroom directly behind me, clinging to the desperate hope of a miraculous sudden change of heart. Jamal saw me walking away, and he saw Richard and Susan standing helplessly in the doorway. The realization that no bail money was coming hit him like a freight train. He was going to sit in a federal holding cell tonight. His survival instinct instantly mutated into pure venomous spite. If he was going down, he was going to make sure he dragged every single one of them down with him. Jamal dug his expensive shoes into the carpet, resisting Agent Thompson's push toward the open elevator. Wait! Jamal screamed, his voice echoing loudly down the entire floor of the law firm. Agent Thompson, wait. I have information. I want to make a deal right now. I can give you a much bigger target. Agent Thompson paused, his expression remaining entirely stoic, but he did not force his prisoner into the elevator. I am listening, Thompson said flatly. Jamal turned his head, his eyes locking onto my father with a look of absolute malicious triumph. You think Vanessa and I are the only ones who took money? Jamal yelled, pointing his cuffed hands directly toward Richard. You need to audit him. Richard has been stealing from the old man for years. Richard froze, his tear-stained face suddenly draining of all color. Shut your mouth, Jamal, Richard hissed, taking a terrified step backward into the boardroom. He has been skimming Grandpa Henry's Social Security checks. Jamal roared, the words spilling out of his mouth at lightning speed. Every single month for the last 4 years. Richard had access to the primary deposit account before Rebecca finally locked it down. He was intercepting the federal benefits and transferring the cash into a hidden offshore trading account to cover his massive day trading losses. He lost thousands of dollars playing the stock market and used federal retirement funds to cover his tracks. I know about it because he asked me how to hide the digital transfers using cryptocurrency platforms. I have his offshore account routing numbers saved on my secure laptop right now. Susan let out a sharp gasp, physically pulling away from her husband as if he had just caught fire. Richard, what is he talking about? She whispered, her voice trembling with a brand new kind of terror. You told me those trading accounts were fully funded by your annual corporate bonuses. You promised me we were financially secure. Richard could not even look at her. He stared at the federal agents, his jaw working silently, looking exactly like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. The golden facade of the respectable patriarch was completely and utterly obliterated. He was not a wealthy victim mourning his father. He was a petty thief who stole from an elderly man to fund a severe gambling addiction. Agent Thompson slowly turned his head, his cold, calculating gaze landing directly on my father. The second IRS agent immediately reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a fresh notepad, clicking his silver pen. Is that so? Thompson asked, his voice low and dangerous. Stealing federal Social Security benefits is a severe federal offense, Mr. Davis. We take the misappropriation of government funds very seriously. We will be adding your name and your financial records to our immediate audit list today. The family completely imploded right there in the hallway. Susan began hitting Richard's chest, screaming hysterically that he had ruined them, that they were going to lose their house. Richard tried to grab her wrists, shouting back that he only did it to keep up with the lifestyle she demanded. Vanessa, still in handcuffs, wailed loudly that her parents were entirely useless and selfish for not saving her. Jamal laughed a manic, broken laugh, deeply satisfied that he had ignited a massive explosion to mask his own catastrophic failure. They were tearing each other apart like a pack of starving wolves. The unyielding loyalty they preached about meant absolutely nothing when faced with the crushing weight of legal accountability. The toxic ecosystem they had built was now eating itself alive right before my eyes. I watched the pathetic display, memorizing the sight of their total destruction. Then I turned my back on the chaos, walked to the stairwell, and confidently left them to the government. I walked down those concrete stairs with a profound sense of closure. The heavy steel door of the law firm clicked shut behind me, completely severing my ties to the toxic bloodline that had tried to drain my life for over 3 decades. I stepped out into the crisp Boston air, took a deep breath of genuine freedom, and never looked back. 6 months have passed since that explosive morning in Attorney Caldwell's office. The wheels of federal justice are notoriously known to turn slowly, but when they finally catch traction, they crush absolutely everything in their path. The legal proceedings were swift, clinical, and entirely devastating for my family. Jamal and Vanessa did not get the dramatic, high-profile courtroom trial they probably envisioned in their delusional minds. When their exhausted public defenders reviewed the mountain of digital evidence the federal agents had compiled, the legal advice was incredibly simple. The prosecution had the IP address logs from Grandpa Henry's tablet, the time-stamped bank routing numbers, and the audio recording of Jamal explicitly confessing to the unauthorized transfer over the phone. Facing an airtight case and the terrifying reality of a 20-year sentence, their arrogant defiance completely collapsed. They took a plea deal. They both stood before a federal judge and formally pled guilty to felony wire fraud and conspiracy to commit tax evasion. Because they were first-time nonviolent offenders, the judge showed a microscopic sliver of mercy and suspended their actual prison time. Instead, they were placed on incredibly strict federal supervised probation for the next 10 years. But avoiding a concrete cell did not mean they escaped punishment. It simply meant their prison was constructed out of financial ruin and public humiliation. Jamal is now required to wear a bulky GPS ankle monitor that tracks his every single movement. He is legally barred from leaving the state of Massachusetts, permanently ending his fake international business trips. Furthermore, the judge mandated that they both complete 500 hours of community service. Vanessa, the woman who complained about being stuck in the rain, cleaning up folding chairs at her own grandfather's funeral, now spends her weekends wearing a bright orange safety vest, picking up trash and clearing debris along the noisy state highways. But the absolute most satisfying consequence is the financial execution delivered by the Internal Revenue Service. You cannot declare bankruptcy on federal restitution. The IRS immediately placed massive garnishments on their wages to recover the stolen $300,000, plus staggering federal penalties, late fees, and compounding interest. Because they are convicted felons specializing in financial fraud, they are legally blacklisted from holding any management positions or working anywhere near corporate finance. Jamal is currently working the overnight shift stocking shelves at a discount grocery store. Vanessa is folding clothes at a basic retail outlet in a strip mall. The federal government forcefully seizes 60% of their meager paychecks before the money even hits their bank accounts. They live in a cramped, miserable studio apartment, unable to afford a divorce lawyer, completely trapped in a toxic marriage built on mutual betrayal and crushing poverty. The fallout for my parents was equally catastrophic. Jamal's desperate hallway confession triggered a massive, highly aggressive forensic audit of Richard's entire financial history. The federal agents found the hidden offshore accounts and the skimmed Social Security deposits within 3 days. Richard was charged with federal misappropriation of government funds. To keep Richard out of a federal penitentiary and to pay the exorbitant retainer fees for the multiple criminal defense attorneys required to handle both his case and Vanessa's case, my parents had to liquidate absolutely everything they owned. They were forced to put their pristine 4-bedroom suburban house on the market for a desperate fire sale price. All the precious home equity Richard used to brag about at family dinners was immediately swallowed up by legal bills, court fines, and mandatory IRS restitution. They lost the house, they lost their leased luxury vehicles, they lost their pristine credit scores and their country club memberships. Susan, who spent her entire life weaponizing her perceived wealth and social status against me, now rents a tiny, outdated 2-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood. She has to clip grocery coupons and ride the public bus because they can no longer afford the insurance on a personal vehicle. The extended family completely excommunicated them, terrified of being associated with convicted felons and federal tax cheats. The generational wealth they were so desperately obsessed with acquiring became the exact mechanism of their total destruction. They tried to build an empire on a foundation of pure greed and entitlement, perfectly willing to sacrifice me in the process. Now they are learning the incredibly harsh reality of the real world, paying for their extreme arrogance, one garnished paycheck at a time. I left Boston behind entirely. I sold the suburban estate shortly after the legal dust settled, transferring the massive equity directly into the corporate holding company. I packed up my life, resigned from my local firm, and accepted a highly lucrative senior partnership at a top-tier forensic accounting agency in the Midwest. Tonight, I am standing on the sprawling glass balcony of my brand-new luxury penthouse apartment, high above the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. The evening wind blowing off Lake Michigan is brisk and incredibly refreshing. The sprawling city skyline stretches out before me in a massive sea of glittering lights, providing a stark, beautiful contrast to the dark, suffocating shadow my biological family used to cast over my entire existence. I am 1,000 miles away from the daily drama, the restrictive federal probations, and the pathetic cramped apartments my parents and my sister now inhabit. I built this peaceful sanctuary out of my own relentless hard work and the genuine love of a grandfather who truly saw my worth. As for the $5 million sitting in the irrevocable trust, I did not touch a single penny for my own personal luxury. I already possessed my own highly successful career and my own independent wealth. Instead, I executed the exact philanthropic vision Grandpa Henry and I had spent 2 years secretly designing in his library. We established the Henry Davis Foundation for Women in Finance, The entire $5 million trust was legally transferred into a massive, heavily protected educational endowment. Every single year, our foundation grants full-ride university scholarships to dozens of brilliant, driven young women from underprivileged backgrounds who want to pursue advanced degrees in forensic accounting, economics, and corporate finance. I personally sit on the board of directors and read every single one of their application essays. I see their profound hunger to build their own independent wealth, free from the toxic control of entitled men or manipulative, greedy relatives. We are actively arming the next generation of women with elite financial literacy, ensuring they never have to rely on someone like Jamal to secure their future, and ensuring they never become financially trapped, like Vanessa. Grandpa Henry's legacy is not funding a fake downtown restaurant or buying vintage champagne in Manhattan. His legacy is currently paying for textbooks, secure dorm rooms, and the bright futures of young women who actually understand the fundamental value of a hard-earned dollar. I lean against the cold metal railing of my balcony and look out over the vibrant city, reflecting on the incredible journey of the past year. For 33 long years, I allowed my parents to dictate my value. I allowed them to define my worth based entirely on my usefulness to their golden child. I let them use the concept of family as a heavy rusted chain to keep me permanently anchored to their dysfunction. They demanded absolute loyalty while offering absolutely nothing but criticism and disdain in return. But standing here tonight, breathing the clean, cold air of my new city, I finally understand the absolute truth about relationships. DNA is nothing more than a simple biological coincidence. It is a random accident of birth. True family is an active, deliberate, and daily choice. It is an ecosystem built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and genuine reciprocal support. A real family celebrates your success instead of demanding you sacrifice your achievements to hide their embarrassing failures. A real family does not view you as an automated teller machine, a convenient scapegoat, or a stepping stone to fund their delusions of grandeur. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to steal your peace, disrespect your boundaries, or commit federal felonies in your name. I had to systematically dismantle my biological family to finally find my own peace, but I do not regret a single second of that chaotic morning in the law firm. I amputated a diseased, toxic limb to save my own life. I took back the power they tried to steal, and I used it to build an absolutely beautiful, quiet, and wildly successful reality. I take a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the distant rhythmic sounds of the Chicago traffic wash over me. I am finally free, entirely financially secure, and unapologetically thriving. The legal and financial trap my family stepped into was entirely of their own making, fueled by their own insatiable greed and stunning arrogance. I did not destroy them. I simply handed them the shovels, stepped back, and let them eagerly dig until they hit the bottom. Never let anyone use the word family as a weapon to abuse you. Have you ever had to let toxic relatives dig their own graves? Tell me your story in the comments below. Hit subscribe for more stories of taking back your power.